Good evening and welcome. Welcome to this opening session tonight of Seeking Truth and Justice in Israel, Palestine. This program is a series of 4 conversations, in person and live streamed. So welcome to those of you in person and welcome to those of you who are streaming live and participating online. So happy to welcome you. We're holding this program from St. Chrysostom's Church in Chicago. My name is Wes Smedley. It's my privilege to serve as the rector of St. Chrysostom's Church. The purpose of these conversations is fourfold: to listen to the voices of Palestinians describing the reality of the situation in Israel-Palestine, to dig into the history of the situation in this part of the world that brought us to where we are today, focusing on the role of the United States, to hear from Jewish voices calling for justice in Palestine, and to consider what we can do to strive for justice and peace in the Holy Land. As a minister, I want to point out that these conversations are occurring in an Episcopal church, or as our presiding Bishop Michael Curry calls it, the Episcopal branch of the Jesus movement. This means that we are framing these 4 conversations not within a partisan political space, nor within a commercial consumer space, but within a moral space. The heart of this Episcopal branch of the Jesus movement is a vow that we make, and I'll quote from our Book of Common Prayer, to strive for justice and peace among all people, and to respect the dignity of every human being. So not peace and justice and dignity for some people or most people, but for all people. And that is a lifetime's calling. The Christian church, we must name, has a checkered history at best of living up to this sacred calling, but we are still at it as the primary goal of our belief. Finally, I want to say that I believe it is the vocation of local congregations like St. Chrysostom's Church in Chicago to host conversations about real things that matter in the world, and to do so from this moral perspective, grounded in the truth as we understand it, in the person of Jesus Christ. To begin this opening session and to welcome our guest speakers tonight, I want to introduce a leader in this parish, a leader in the Episcopal Diocese of Chicago's Peace and Justice Committee, and a person whom I admire very much, John McLees. I want to express my deep and profound gratitude for John and the group of persistent leaders who put this workshop together. You know who you are. Thank you so much. And now, as we begin tonight's session on current conditions in Gaza, the West Bank and East Jerusalem, please pause for a moment and pray with me, if you would. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Heavenly Father, in your word, you have given us a vision of the holy city to which all the nations of the world bring their glory. Behold and visit now, we pray, all cities of the earth: Jerusalem, Gaza, Ramallah, Damascus, Kabul, Baghdad, Baltimore, Detroit, Chicago. Renew the ties of mutual regard which form our civic life. Send us honest and able leaders. Enable us to eliminate poverty, prejudice, and oppression, that peace may prevail with righteousness, that justice may prevail with order. Grant that men and women and people from different cultures and with differing talents may find with one another the fulfillment of their humanity. This we ask for your love's sake. Amen. John McLees, take it away.
Thank you, Wes, for that introduction to our programs and for the focus on justice that has created an opportunity to present these programs at St. Chrysostom's Church and to welcome all those who are joining us in this journey. This is a subject that has many strands and many claims and history that goes back even farther than the formation of the State of Israel. But tonight we're going to focus on the current conditions in the occupied territories in Palestine, that is in Gaza, in the so-called West Bank, and in East Jerusalem. We'll hear from valued Palestinian friends, my Kakish, Khader, and Jihad Absaleem, who is on your screen remotely, who will provide testimony on the impact on them and their families of the condition that Israel imposes on Palestinians living in the occupied territories. We'll then be privileged to hear from Jennifer Bing, who is director of the Palestine Activism Program of the American Friends Services Committee here in Chicago. We'll leave time after that for your questions to our speakers, and we encourage you to submit your questions in the chat for those who are participating remotely, and for those of you who are present in the sanctuary by writing your questions on the cards you have received and that our colleagues are collecting. You raise your hands. First, however, it falls on me to set the stage for our series of programs with a more systematic summary of Israel's treatment of the Palestinian people in the occupied territories and in Israel itself, as background for the powerful testimony that you will hear from me and from Jihad. Unfortunately, as most of you know, Israel's oppression of the Palestinian people is sufficiently determined and comprehensive that it is difficult to summarize briefly. But we need to see the situation as a whole and to name it. So please bear with me. As noted in the maps that I think we were displaying as you were entering the program, Israel has built on its original colonization of Palestine with restrictions on movement and residency to fragment the Palestinian population in order to concentrate it in Gaza and other isolated cities and enclaves in the West Bank, including cities that were given a level of Palestinian control under the 1995 Oslo Accord. As we all know, the Israeli government promotes and supports Israeli settlements, now containing more than 600,000 Jewish residents established and operated in violation of international law, all over the remaining 60% of the occupied territories that appeared in white on that map that Israel controls directly in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, continuing to displace Palestinians from their land and their homes through a process of ethnic cleansing that began in establishing the State of Israel. In addition to suffering sewage runoff and other ongoing incursions from hilltop settlements, the Palestinians remaining in those areas are increasingly subject to violent attacks and to destruction of their crops and their olive trees by Israeli settlers who act with impunity, often with direct support from the Israeli military. The Israeli settlers are subject to Israeli civil and criminal law and live in modern cities and communities that Israel has connected with well-paved, segregated roads that Palestinians are not allowed to use. By contrast, Palestinians in the West Bank live in a broken-up territory, sometimes completely surrounded by a barrier wall, with poor roads, often with restricted access to their own remaining land, and subject to separate, often brutal, and arbitrary military rule, without freedom of movement, without fundamental rights such as property rights, freedom of assembly, and any meaningful role in political participation, and subject to brutal campaigns of collective punishment and constant targeting of its children as part of the psychological warfare utilized by Israel to constantly remind the Palestinian population that it is subjugated and occupied. Other aspects of Israel's program of ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from their land are its refusal to grant building permits to the growing Palestinian population in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and its ongoing program of demolishing many Palestinian homes each year, often on short notice. The process of ethnic cleansing of Muslims and Christians is in advanced stages in and around Jerusalem and Bethlehem, 6 miles to the south, being undertaken through land confiscation and home demolitions that are proceeding rapidly, with Bethlehem in particular now hemmed in by Jewish settlements and roads that are restricted to use by settlers. With Israel's approval in April of this year of annexation of large additional areas of Palestinian land near Bethlehem, and with a new Israeli order earlier this month calling for seizure of more large areas of Palestinian land nearby. Israel relies on many techniques to implement its expulsion of Palestinians from their homes in Jerusalem, such as demolition orders, disguised land purchases, and supporting the ongoing attempts by Israeli settlers to expel Palestinians from their homes in, for example, the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of Jerusalem. As you'll recall, the outbreak of violence in May resulted from Israel's violent attacks on Palestinians protesting those expulsions and Israel's invasion of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. But those maps don't tell the complete story. In fact, Israel exerts complete control, expressly including all legislative, executive, and judicial powers in the entire area between the Jordan River and the sea, including the enclaves in the occupied territories that we pictured that are nominally governed in part by the Palestinian Authority, which, among other things, also operates as a subcontract for the Israeli security forces. All of the 6.8 million people, Palestinians living in Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Israel itself, are subject to severe restrictions on their movements and on where they may live, often permanently separating family members who may live as close as 20 or 30 miles apart. In addition to Israel's laws preventing Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza and the diaspora from returning to Israel, those restrictions on freedom of movement include rules preventing Palestinians from traveling or moving from Gaza to the West Bank, even for essential medical care or to reunite families, and rules prohibiting Palestinian residents of the State of Israel itself from traveling from the underserved enclaves where they tend to live back to the areas in Israel from which they and their families were displaced in the creation of the state. Among the most dehumanizing travel restrictions are the arbitrary, burdensome, and time-consuming controls, including 600 physical checkpoints, roadblocks, and other permanent obstacles to movement that Palestinians must navigate on a daily basis to travel between locations within the West Bank, if they're able to complete the journeys at all, as dramatized in the short Academy Award-nominated film The Present, for which we have placed a link in the materials that we've distributed. The Israeli government controls all trade, all international cash flows, and all natural resources within the West Bank, and it often denies food and water and health supplies for Palestinians. Israel prohibits the 2.7 million Palestinians who live in the West Bank from obtaining water from the aquifers under the land, and even from collecting rainwater. And it has destroyed hundreds of water wells, pipelines, and cisterns that Palestinians have installed to obtain or store water, forcing them to buy water in limited quantities and inflated prices from Israel, which Israel extracts from the same aquifers. As a result, Palestinians in the West Bank are limited to an average of 73 liters of water per person per day, less than the normal minimums, and less than 1/4 of the 300 liters per day consumed by the average Israeli, including those living in the illegal settlements next door, with well-watered gardens and swimming pools. Even with that, some Palestinians in the West Bank spend as much as 1/4 of their income on water. Israel also exercises control over the 2 million people living effectively as prisoners in Gaza, an area a little bigger than the south side of Chicago, which Israel has placed under blockade and military siege since 2007, with catastrophic consequences for the people of Gaza. Israel controls Gaza's electricity, its communication infrastructure, its water supplies, its coastal waters, and all other natural resources. And it has killed Palestinian fishermen who don't abide by the severe restrictions on the areas in which Israel allows them to fish. As you know, Israel has also bombed Gaza ferociously several times since 2007, including the 11 days of bombardment in May of this year, a process that Israeli officials have referred to as periodic, quote, mowing of the grass, close quote. Israel justifies the vastly disproportionate destruction of its bombing raids compared to the minimal damage that it suffers from rockets and fire balloons that it receives from Gaza as collective punishment for the people of Gaza. In addition to killing thousands of Gazans and destroying thousands of buildings in its periodic bombing campaigns, Israel has prevented the Palestinians in Gaza from replacing sewage treatment plants and other critical infrastructure that Israel has destroyed. In the past 2 years, Israel has escalated its violence against the people of Gaza with a prolonged campaign of shooting unarmed protesters in Gaza from positions in Israel, killing hundreds and deliberately maiming thousands of protesters. Well, in 2 exhaustive reports on Israel's treatment of the Palestinian people issued earlier this year, both Human Rights Watch and Israel's leading human rights organization, Abusalim, concluded that Israel's program of severe discriminatory oppression of the Palestinian people constitutes a regime of apartheid, which international criminal law has long regarded as a crime against humanity, as defined in the 1973 International Apartheid Convention and in the 1998 Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. The materials that we've distributed contains links to both of those important reports, and we hope that you will read them. Both Human Rights Watch and Abusalim have rejected Israel's position that its actions in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza are necessary for its security. Moreover, Israel undertakes all of this under plans that its leaders have articulated and implemented consistently with great specificity since the founding of the State of Israel, to create a state solely for the benefit of Jews in the entire territory between the Jordan River and the sea, and to suppress the indigenous Christian and Muslim population that it cannot manage to drive out of the area. Now, to undermine international pressure to change its policies toward Palestinians, Israel and many of its supporters defame Israel's critics, who include a growing number of American Jews, by falsely accusing them of being anti-Semitic, spending millions of dollars to silence their voices and in some cases ruin their careers, while embracing proponents of real anti-Semitism who happen to support Israel in its oppression of the Palestinian people. Well, our first speaker this evening to discuss the real-world implications of Israel's regime of apartheid for individual Palestinians and their families is May Khader. May, among other things, is director of a program that she founded for teaching Arabic language and culture to Arab American children in the Chicago area. She's also a board member of the Shiraz Library Project, which supports the creation and operation of libraries for children and adults in Palestine. And she is the founder and writer of almondandfig.com, where you can find instructions for preparing a huge variety of wonderful Palestinian dishes of all kinds. May?
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me tonight. It's a pleasure to be here with you tonight. I was born and raised by a Christian family in Palestine. In fact, we attended a church as beautiful as this one in Jerusalem, St. George Episcopal Church. My pastor at the time, Reverend Naeem Ati, who will be speaking to you later this month, was my pastor while I was growing up in Palestine. I came to Chicago in 1995 on a scholarship program to attend North Park University here on the north side. And later on, I pursued my higher education in public relations at DePaul University. I was born in Jerusalem. I lived in an area called Al-Ram. Al-Ram is a town located about 8 kilometers northeast of Jerusalem. Al-Ram in Arabic means the hill. And as children, we could go on scavenger hunts with my cousins, and we would go up the hill exploring wild plants and chasing the sunset. As teens, we would go on walks towards Jerusalem and treat ourselves to Usama's pizza, which was my favorite pizza at the time. It was so good. My favorite was the one with green olives. After that, we would walk up Al-Quds Road. It's the main road between Ramallah and Jerusalem, towards Beit Hanina to get knafe. Knafe is a Palestinian dessert made out of sugary syrup and stretchy cheese. It was really good. We would walk and walk up that road until we really got tired. and sometimes we got too tired that we took a taxi back home. Before 2003, Aram was considered an ideal geographic location between Ramallah and Jerusalem. It was an economically and commercially active town, hustling with vendors and women farmers that would come from the nearby villages to sell their produce at the town. And there was a lot of business people in my village that would commute in and out of Jerusalem daily. Aram now is home to Israel's Apartheid Wall, surrounded by Israeli settlements and 3 chaotic checkpoints, Qalandia, Jab'a, and Hizma. All these checkpoints and the wall is built on thousands of dunams and land that is stolen from the people of my village. The Apartheid Wall surrounds Aram on 3 sides. West of the village, Israel has built a wall about 8 to 13 meters high, depending on where it is located, along the main road to Ramallah in the West Bank. The wall stretches several hundred meters, separating the neighborhoods from one another. This wall cut off my town from the nearby villages and prevented the farmers from coming to sell their goods, which was their only livelihood. It detached my hometown from Jerusalem, separating the residents from their jobs, schools, health system, Osama's Pizza, and the long walks to the sweet knafe shop down Al-Quds Street. The wall not only separated families from one another, but forced Palestinians to acquire permits to access their own land, and many of these permits are often denied. The Apartheid Wall has also cut off access to traditional water resources or sources. Israel controls natural resources in Palestine, and they don't distribute it justly. According to the WHO, Palestinians don't even meet the daily requirement of 100 liters per capita, while water consumption for an Israeli is about 4 times that of a Palestinian living in the occupied territory. I remember visiting home one summer with my children. I have 3 girls here in Chicago. When the water in my town got cut off, my daughter screamed that she couldn't flush the toilet, and there was no water dripping from the faucet. This story repeated itself for days, and now it's a norm of life. My father at the time felt humiliated and angry. He felt as if he couldn't give his grandchildren a basic need during their summer vacation. The true meaning of this oppression struck me in 1987 when the first Intifada started. I was 10 years old at the time when I realized life has changed. It's not normal anymore. As a young girl, I recall the days that we weren't able to play outside because of curfew, and at times we couldn't go to school for weeks at a time. I do clearly remember the burning smell of tear gas and the gunpowder that filled the air. I remember a crippling sensation that I felt when the Israeli soldiers surrounded our house in May of 1989 and got on the neighbors' rooftops and arrested my father in the middle of the night. I do vividly remember my mother's order to stay in bed and pretend to stay sleeping while she dressed my father in layers of clothing and whispered some words in his ear. Months went by, and we didn't know what happened to my father. We couldn't locate him. But a few months later, we started receiving letters from my dad, to find out later on in life that those letters were actually written by my mother, just a way to comfort us during that time. My father was sent to Ansar Iii Prison. This prison is in the Naqab, which is a desert south of Palestine. Ansar Iii is a prison that's closed today for its hostile environment and terrible conditions. My mother, along with many other Palestinian women, had to bear the effects of the Israeli oppression and make the greatest sacrifices. My mom had to keep the family together and take on necessary survival responsibilities alone. My sister and I also took responsibilities at the age of 12 for our 2 younger brothers. We took charge of cooking, cleaning, while other kids our age spent on other parts of the world, spent time in sports, music, and hobbies. In college at North Park, I was a student at an event on campus my freshman year, and I remember them clearly asking us what our hobbies were. And I thought for a while, and I actually really felt embarrassed. I didn't recall spending time figuring out what my hobbies were. In fact, no one ever asked me that in Palestine. I blurted out, cooking. My hobby, I said, is cooking. Later in life, actually now, I made cooking and writing my hobby, and a way and a platform to tell my Palestinian story. You can visit me on Almond and Fig, like you mentioned, for some recipes and a lot of stories that are important for preserving and protecting our Palestinian identity and historic and culinary heritage. In the Second Intifada, which is in 2001, today actually is the anniversary of the Second Intifada. It's been a really heavy week. The story repeated itself. The Israeli soldiers came to our house once again, but this time it was for my two younger brothers. My brother Saliba was 17 years old at the time, and Lu'ay was 16. During their arrest, my brothers were blindfolded, and their hands and feet were bound. On the ride to the police station in Jerusalem, they were beaten, cursed, and humiliated. Neither my parents nor the lawyers were allowed during their interrogation, and they were forced to sign documents in a language they didn't speak, Hebrew. They were put in Israeli jails for 1 year, and they spent another 6 months under house arrest. The only crime my brothers committed is that they were youth. Palestinian youth were a threat to Israel's security. My parents spent months upon months, a big chunk of their time, chasing my brothers from jail to jail, from court to another. Lu'ay, my younger brother, missed his high school graduation, and Saliba, the older one, he missed the deadline to apply for college. But while in prison, my brother inked his own tattoo on his arm that says, "Don't cry, my mother." Since 2000, over 13,000 Palestinian children in the West Bank have been arrested and held in Israeli military detention without access to basic rights, just like my brothers. Israel is the only country in the world that tries children in a military court. I really can't possibly tell you my whole life story in the next few minutes because my story started long before I was born. It started when my grandfather, Sido Saliba, Sido is Arabic for grandfather, he purchased a home in the Katamon neighborhood around 1940. It's a beautiful, predominantly Christian Palestinian neighborhood in the West Jerusalem area. My grandfather's new home was robbed from him after 1948 Nakba, although we have the paperwork, brought it right here, to prove the ownership to his home and the lemon trees that are still surrounding it. After 1967, my father, along with Sido, went back to check on the home to find it occupied by a Jewish Yemenite family that actually called the police on my feisty father. The appeal to get our home will forever be rejected in the racist Israeli courts. The law denies Palestinians the right to return to their homes they were displaced from during the Nakba and allows Jewish settlers to claim those properties as abandoned. The same apartheid regime that we currently see actually in Sheikh Jarrah, Silwan, Al-Khan al-Ahmar, and other neighborhoods in East Jerusalem. The families of these communities have been fighting against home demolition and settler takeovers for decades. They are constantly faced with threats, violence from the armed settlers, and the settlers are actually backed by police and Israeli soldiers, and the daily instabilities. Israel wants a demographic majority to fulfill its Jerusalem master plan of 2020, 70% Jewish population. Jerusalem, where I was born, is currently facing the largest coordinated ethnic cleansing efforts since 1967. Israel plans to steal over 200 homes in East Jerusalem, which puts about 1,000 Palestinians at risk of homelessness. The families of Al-Qatamon neighborhood never abandoned their homes, as Israel proclaims. It's called ethnic cleansing, to make room for all the Jewish settlers coming from Europe to settle in their new stolen homes. Ethnic cleansing is not a mistake. These racist policies are rooted in a developed and concrete settler colonial ideology, Zionism. They wanted to create an exclusive Jewish homeland in an already populated land with people, homes, backyards, and lemon trees. My grandfather passed away many years ago. He died without ever being allowed to step foot in what was once his home. As for me today, although I was born and raised in Jerusalem, I'm treated like a foreigner, and my family has conditional and revocable status. I left Palestine to study in Chicago, and Israel determined that's too long of a stay, and that I no longer maintain a connection to Jerusalem, despite my birth certificate and my parents and family that still live there. So I currently enter my homeland as a tourist, often needing a permit to come and go. I could stand here for hours to describe the 54 years of occupation, describe it by the various Israeli operations in Gaza, or like John mentioned, the intifadas, the escalation in recent months, Jerusalem, home demolitions, settlement expansions. But this would be a partial picture of the daily reality and daily life for us Palestinians. A reality of the Israeli government deciding what leaves or enters Gaza, who and what leaves the West Bank and enters the West Bank. The reality is that Israeli soldiers are waking and terrifying children in their own homes in the middle of the night during mapping missions. Israeli bulldozers destroying homes, infrastructures, uprooting trees, burning and damaging crops, or worrying sick about the safety for children crossing checkpoints to and from school, and the settler attacks on civilians, or the chaotic checkpoints that are a system of permanent control over Palestinian life, making daily movement incredibly difficult. It places obstacles in the way of Palestinians, inhibiting them from carrying out even the most ordinary tasks, like going to work, to school, to the market, to church, to the mosque, or the water, the electricity that could get off without notice in the middle of cooking, cleaning, showering, or watering the garden. It's a gray everyday. It's a gray everyday reality that has continued for far too long. The reality that takes its toll on life every single day. This is a day-to-day occupation. My whole life since I came to the United States surrounded answering the question, where are you from? My identity raises a lot of questions. As a Palestinian, I learned that Zionism propaganda is denying my existence. My grandmother just passed away last month at the age of 93, and I'm almost turning 43 years old, and we both are still justifying our existence and answering the question, where are you from? But I'm here today to remind the world that I and we Palestinians do exist. We once had a home in Al-Qatamon in Jerusalem that had beautiful lemon trees. We once walked to Osama's pizza shop without a checkpoint, that my grandmother's veranda once had a view that wasn't concrete and steel. The system that prevents some of us from being fully human, prevent all of us from being fully human. Thank you for taking the time and listening, and may this empower you to work in your own communities for a just and peace Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you, May. That deserves a lot of time for reflection. I hope we all will engage in that in days and weeks to come, but we must go on. Next, we'll hear from Jihad Absaleem, who is a prominent and much sought-after speaker on the situation in Gaza. Jihad grew up in Gaza and has family there. He is an education and policy associate in the Palestine activism program of the American Friends Services Committee in Chicago, and a PhD candidate in history and Judaic studies at New York University. Jihad, welcome.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation. It is an honor to once again, speak with people in Chicago. Unfortunately, I'm not based there anymore, as I'm speaking to you all from Boston. But Chicago is home, and And for me, it's the place in the United States that ended kind of my homesickness to Palestine, because of the power of community and of how much love and support I experienced there. And yeah, I'm very thankful for this opportunity. Oh, I'm sorry, I muted myself. I wanted to say that I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak to you all tonight. And I mean, building on what Mai said in her powerful presentation, and I know that I was asked to focus on Gaza tonight and to talk about what's happening there through the lens of my experience and my family's. And I am going to do that. I will say a few words on the current situation and the reality that the people in Gaza have been experiencing and going through. But I really want to start by saying something that I only thought about today as I was preparing for this event. I am in regular touch with my siblings in Gaza. I have 2 brothers and 1 sister. And I realized today that since May, since the aggression against Gaza in May, that my siblings and I, we haven't talked about what happened in May. And this happens usually after every major military operation. People there try their best not to think about what just happened to them. And I realized that I did that myself. During the war, myself, Jennifer, and my colleagues at the FSC, we were hyperactive and trying, we were working like bees around the clock, helping people in Gaza tell their stories via writing, putting people in touch with the media, spreading the word, tweeting, writing on Facebook, writing to members of Congress, encouraging people to write to their elected representatives. And after the war came to a temporary end, because in a few years, or more or less, there will be another, I stopped thinking about what happened in May. And today I forced myself to think about what happened in May. And I realized how difficult it is to go back to this time. And what made this really painful is that in these days, people are commemorating the beginning of the Second Intifada, almost 21 years ago. And I was looking at what my friends and people who are slightly older than me, people who are slightly younger than me, writing about the beginning of the Second Intifada, and I noticed that people from my generation are starting to publicly process collectively that traumatizing experience that they went through when people like me were in 5th grade in the year 2000. And then I basically thought about what I read on, because for every event there is an anniversary, and on each anniversary people write on social media. And I realized that last year and the year before, my friends, my colleagues, my family, they just started talking about the 2008-2009 aggression against Gaza, which led to 1,500 deaths and more than 3,000, I think, were injured. And I realized that people, on the last anniversary of the 2014 war or aggression against Gaza, people did not say much. And that kind of shows the heavy burden someone who is 33 years like me, or someone who's 20 years old like my sister, carry in this life. And that, of course, alone makes me think about my wife's grandfather, who's, thankfully he's still alive and well, who was born in 1930 and who was 18 years old in 1948 and who vividly remembers what happened in 1948 as if it just happened yesterday. It makes me think of my father, who was born in 1955 and he's now in his mid-60s, and all the horrors that he witnessed in 1967 during the Israeli occupation. That was the first formative event that he witnessed. So all these reflections today made me think about my sister, my younger sister Hala, who is going to be 21 in November of this year. I left Gaza in 2013. Hala was 13 years old. And Hala was born in the year 2000, in November 2000, just a few weeks after the Second Intifada started. And I remember the night she was born. We had to call the ambulance from the Nasser hospital in the city of Khan Yunis, which is just like 3 or 4 miles to the south of the town where I lived and grew up, Deir al-Balah. And that night, I remember vividly that the ambulance had to pass through the Gush Katif checkpoint that separated Deir al-Balah and Khan Yunis, and pass through Israeli tanks and bulldozers and towers and whatnot. And thankfully, my mom and my aunt and my dad, they all made it to the hospital. My sister was born, she came home. And I remember that on every night of my sister's childhood, because we lived next to the Israeli settlement of Khader, which was a tiny settlement in the middle of the Gaza Strip, bordering my hometown, Deir al-Balah. And that settlement was home for around 300, 400 settlers. And before the Second Intifada started, my father, we built a really nice home on our land, which we inherited from like my grandfather and my great-grandfather. We built this home next to the settlement, and we moved just right before the Second Intifada started. So fast forward, my sister is born, and every night, I remember from the year 2000 until Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza in 2005, every night there was either shooting, or there were sounds of bulldozers destroying farmland, or there was like a ground invasion of my town, and so on and so forth. And then 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza. This were the first 5 years of my sister's life. Comes 2006, Legislative Council elections. Hamas wins. The United States, the international community, does not like the results of the elections, so they sanction Gaza. The blockade starts. My sister's 7 years old. So what she had experienced in her life were 5 years of the Second Intifada and the turmoil that followed the Palestinian Legislative Council elections in 2006, which the international community did not like. And then in 2008, my sister witnessed the caste-led aggression, so-called caste-led operation against Gaza. She was 8 years old, and she witnessed that. In that war, we had a family friend, Moroccan, who was married to a Palestinian man, friends with my family, and we knew these people closely, and they were killed during the war. So, my sister experienced the death of someone close very, very early in her life. In 2012, my sister lived through the 2012 attack in Gaza, and she experienced more explosions. In 2014, my sister lived through the 2014 attack in Gaza. And during that attack, our neighborhood was bombed. There was a candy factory across the street from our home, which the Israeli artillery bombed, and they had to evacuate. And due to the intensity of the bombing, my family had to split into two, so that if something happens to one half of the family, the other half survives. And they lived in two different homes of our relatives in two different parts of the town because of the intensity of the bombing. My father, who witnessed parts of the Lebanese civil war, and he lived through the 1978 invasion of Lebanon, he described what he witnessed in the 2014 attack on Gaza as something that he did not experience in Lebanon during his 5-year stay. And that in itself, I'm sure a lot of you remember, vividly remember hearing the reports from Lebanon from that. I wasn't in Gaza in 2014. I left in 2013. I started my studies here, and fast forward to 2021. In May of this year, my little sister also experienced another attack. Sounds of explosions, glass shattering at night, not knowing whether you will go to bed and you'll wake up alive. And sadly, the more technology improves, the more you can be on the phone for most of that and experience the moments of horror and look at their faces and feel and curse that feeling of your inability to do anything about it. May was definitely a really difficult month, especially during the attack on Gaza. And like I said, the reason why I started with that part about how and when people process. It takes time. It takes time for people to process the most recent traumatic and violent moments that they go through, and we try to people try to be steadfast and resilient and strong, but there are limits. The famous line from Kulthum, the famous Egyptian singer then, who said, in Arabic, إِنَّمَا الصَّبْرُ حدود, even for patience there are limits, right? And that pain and that suffering and that endless cycle that we have been experiencing before 1948, and which 1948 solidified, the moment when the state of Israel was established and many Palestinians became refugees. That moment solidified the cycle, the recurring cycle of how violence is produced and reproduced within historic Palestine in order to keep Israel a Jewish majority state the way it is. Palestinians have to suffer. It was the Zionist movement that set in motion this mutually exclusive equation that kind of sets the terms for how things unfold, for how life unfolds within the boundaries of historic Palestine, recently Israel, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank, and in Palestine as Palestine of the Palestinians, which extends beyond the boundaries of historic Palestine, where Palestinian human existence exists, right? They're from here about a large diaspora and exile and so on and so forth. So this pain continues because of a reality that is that does not make sense. It's not logical. Israel wanted to establish a Jewish majority state. They knew what the price will be. They knew what the consequences will be for Palestinians, but they did not care. They did not care. And the entire project from its inception was about creating a reality and managing that reality and disciplining Palestinians when they resist. And this has been the cycle since 1948. We saw that in 1948. We saw that in 1955. We saw that in 1956 when Gaza was occupied. We saw that, in 1967 after Israel conquered the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, Sinai, and we saw that during the 80s when the first Intifada happened. We saw that after the Palestinian surrender in the Oslo Accords wasn't enough. We saw that in the second Intifada, and we see that in the recurring military aggression and settlement building and expansion. We see that it's a pattern. It's a pattern. Again, it's an equation. There must be a Jewish majority state at the expense of Palestinian life and well-being. If Palestinians resist, discipline them, punish them, kill them, expel them, and make them pay the heaviest of prices. And in the words of the Israeli military, mow the law. So I think we are at this moment in time, I'm about to finish, after almost a century of cynicism on the part of the international community, disregard of Palestinian humanity, started with the British first, who came with their very bright plans for Palestine, and then handed over, nothing but chaos and tragedy and destruction, and now they're acting like nothing happened. And after decades of the international community led by the West, basically, trying to disregard what's happening to Palestinians because, Europeans want to just, process their feeling of guilt towards, the Jewish people and what Europe has committed against them by, giving the Zionists Palestine and dismissing the actual roots of, racism and white supremacy in Europe that actually led to, mass genocidal crimes like the Holocaust. And after decades of imposing certain, framework to deal with Palestine that first started with complete, total disregard for Palestinian humanity and existence and nationalism and right for self-determination, and later, kind of realized that Palestinians need to exist, but this existence needs to be limited to ways that only fit in with Israel's narrow vision for how to maintain its security, how to maintain its Jewish majority reality, how to maintain giving privileges to its majority Jewish citizens, while at the same time limiting the Palestinian well-being, dignity, and suppressing Palestinian voices. But I think the question for us at this moment in history, after we saw the dismantlement of apartheid in South Africa, after the world went through decolonization throughout the past century, I think the question for us, until when this will continue, and what is it that we need to do in order for this to come to an end, because it's not sustainable, and the cost of this project to maintain the status quo is very high. I value the life of my siblings, the lives of my siblings. For me, my siblings and the people like them, younger than them, older than them, every person in Gaza or in Palestine in general, Palestinians, they are people, they're humans, and they not only need the sympathy, but they need the proactive commitment by people around the world to put an end to this cynical charade that started in the early 20th century and continues until the present day. This is a cynical charade. It does not make sense. It doesn't make sense that the existence, the well-being, the dignity, the ability of an entire people as a group and as individuals to realize their potential is just put on hold because some other people want to realize a vision that does not work. Zionism never worked. It's not working right now, and it's not going to work in the future. So I guess we need courage. We need the courage to be able to say it as to be able to recognize that, yes, the task to free Palestinians and from Zionist oppression and to free Jews in historic Palestine from this narrow-minded Zionist vision and to free the region from this endless cycle that keeps producing and reproducing itself for over a century, this requires difficult work, and that people are willing to do this difficult work, especially in the United States, because the United States has subsidized for a very long time this project and contributed heavily to making it continue and to sustain it the way it is. So yes, join us. We are in a movement that is hopeful and optimistic despite all these tragedies and despite all this pain and despite all this history. I wake up every day, I have my coffee, and then I hop on calls with Jennifer and with Mike and with other people in AFSC, and we do our work like we're working in any like basic company, because we need, but we're not basic. Didn't mean basic in that sense, but we need this passion. We cannot afford burnout. We cannot afford hopelessness. We cannot afford the lack of optimism. Because for me, personally, before it's a national struggle, before it's an abstract question of self-determination and national liberation and so on and so forth, it's about my disabled brother who has epileptic seizures, who suffers when the bombs fall. I just don't want my brother who has epileptic seizures, who has more of them when the bombs fall. I don't want my mother to wake up at 3 a.m. and run, under the staircase so that she doesn't want the glass to shatter and fall on her head. My father is in his mid-60s. He's nothing but he's silent all the time and sad. And because of his dignity, he does not want to talk about how much pain he went through. I don't want my sister Hala to measure her life by how many wars she's experienced. I want her to measure her life, to count the years by positive, beautiful experiences, academic success and achievement. Who is, by the way, top of her class, studying management information systems at the University of Palestine in Gaza. And she's recently got accepted into the Gaza Skylinks program as one of their top app developers. These are people who we need to help and support. And that's why tonight, I rarely cry on a call, but or on an event like this, but this really, like, I haven't really spoken like this since May. And really we need you. Join us, help us, support us. And our freedom will be realized one day. Thank you.
Thank you, Jihad. Thank you for the truths that you've spoken, which our corrupted information environment blocks from us. And thank you for your call to action, which we all must heed. After hearing from May and Jihad, I think it should pain us as Christians that we have taken so long to put attention on these matters, not just because the truths are blocked from us, but because we haven't paid enough attention ourselves. And I think it should pain us all as citizens that the United States government provides the foundation for Israel's impunity from any meaningful consequences for its actions, and it does so in many ways, including blocking action by international bodies like the United Nations, by attempting to disrupt investigations of Israel's actions of the International Criminal Court and others, by pretending to act as an honest broker, while in fact acting in support of Israel's positions in the quote, peace talks that it has promoted over the last 40 years, and as Jihad points out, and as we all know, by providing more than $10 million a day in military aid to Israel, mostly without conditions, much of which Israel uses to finance its military occupation of the West Bank and Jerusalem and the atrocities that we've heard about today, and including the vastly disproportionate military violence that it visits on the people of Gaza. Our final speaker, Jennifer Bing, will discuss the ongoing efforts of the American Friends Services Committee, the Jewish Voice for Peace, and others to convince our leaders to move towards speaking the truth about Israel's actions and toward promoting justice in Palestine, Israel. Jennifer, please give us a brief account of that.
Thank you, John. I'm just wanting to do a check on time because I really think what May and Jehad have shared with us is just so incredibly powerful. I'm so proud of these two incredible storytellers and whose lives have just touched mine so deeply, and I'm sure the people in the audience and watching today. So I kind of don't want to say anything because this was so powerful, and I don't want to, so I'm just looking to you for advice. Like, do you want me to spend 5 minutes talking about what I had said I would talk about, which is the kind of political climate for organizing, or should we just let that go and stay focused on these two powerful stories?
Thank you, Jennifer. Maybe you could just briefly talk about one of the things that has occupied our attention, your attention, and with great effect in the last couple of years, and that is the campaign for No Way to Treat a Child, and the legislation that's proposed, and the high hill it has to climb, but the progress that's being made and how people can support that very limited acknowledgement of how the U.S. behaves and supports the situation.
Okay, all right. You're telling me I'm not off the hook. I still need to speak, so I'll give a few minutes. And again, thank you for having this program. I think the role that faith communities have in creating the conversations and changing the discourse about Palestine and Palestinian rights. It happens like at events like this, where somebody's story, like May's story of her brother tattooing his arm while in detention, or Jihad's mother hiding from the falling glass. Those kind of stories are the things that haven't been told in ways that seem to penetrate a lot of our political discourse in this country. But I want to say that I feel that it's changing. I've been working with the American Friends Service Committee since 1989, and when I went to congressional offices here with Senator Paul Simon, if those of you remember, and other members of Congress in the 80s and 90s, there were not sympathetic members of Congress who would say anything publicly about Palestinian rights, and despite a lot of efforts to educate them and to bring speakers for them to see and so forth, there was very little progress. And I remember at AFSC that we kept feeling like we didn't think that people really understood what life under military occupation was like. All the detail that you gave at the beginning, John, about what is the historical precedents and illustrated so well by May and Jihad about the experience of it, people just somehow didn't have their ears weren't open to it, I guess. They would see on occasion a child throwing a stone at a tank during the first uprising in the 1980s, but they didn't really understand what that power dynamic was. They didn't understand about the systemic violence and two sets of laws and the kind of apartheid conditions that Human Rights Watch and Abusalim and Palestinians have been trying to talk about for decades. So when we came up with the No Way to Treat a Child campaign, which American Friends Service Committee started with Defense for Children International Palestine, which is a Palestinian human rights group based in Ramallah, where that does both legal services work, so represents children in the military system, but also advocates on their behalf, so collects documentation and reports and takes it to the United Nations and other agencies to try to bring about change and to hold Israel into account for the abuse of children. They were looking for a way to do advocacy in the United States, and so we came up with this idea of taking a small slice of life, of occupation, and focusing on Palestinian children and their treatment or mistreatment that May so poignantly described, the night raids, the lack of security and safety for families, and the kind of impact that has on communities. And when we started to talk about that aspect of the occupation, we started to find members of Congress be a little more open. Instead of talking about what's the solution, should it be 2 states or 1 state, and who's the legitimate representative of which people and which government is in power, we got really to the heart of the matter. And I think that the current climate in this country of beginning to look at where does violence start, what is the context, why are people angry, why are people demonstrating, why are people demanding rights and representation. And I think that kind of questioning climate that we're in and have been in, and certainly during the last U.S. administration, watching our own rights be taken away and more militarism in this country and around the world. So I think that all the convergence of those forces has really given us opportunity to talk to members of Congress. And in 2017, Representative Bentley McCullum from Minnesota introduced the first bill to address Palestinian children's rights, and it was the first bill in U.S. history that addressed Palestinian rights at all. I mean, the occupation had been along a long time by 2017, and that was, an incredible, marker for our movement, and I think a good testament to a strategy of how to even move those most powerful, and to do exactly what you said as well, John, about what is our accountability in it. How, for so many decades, has our government turned a blind eye to these human rights abuses and continued to give a blank check to an Israeli government to abuse and occupy and colonize Palestinian territory. So those right now in Congress, since 2017, every congressional session, and they go every 2 years, as you know, there's been a new bill, and the one currently is H.R. 2590. It's got a very long title, but we call it the Palestinian Children's and Families Act, and that does focus still on trying to put a light on the experience of Palestinian children who are detained, 13,000 of them between the age of 12 and 18 have been arrested since the year 2000, so in the last 21 years. And they continue to be arrested every month. And so that is part of the bill. The other part does address the issue of house demolitions and destruction of Palestinian property that May referred to in Jerusalem has been definitely a battleground, really, over settlers taking over homes and evicting families that have lived there, some of them who were uprooted during the Nakba in 1948 from West Jerusalem, where May's family was from. And then the last part is annexation. And at the beginning of the program, there was you saw a map of the, I think that was the map, I couldn't see it, but I assume it was the map of the kind of shrinking territory that Palestinians have control over. And that annexation is, purposeful and continuing, and our government just turns a blind eye, and even last week just added another $1 billion in military aid and arms sales to Israel. So we have 30 members of Congress plus McCollum, so that's 31 who've supported this bill. That's a far cry from 435. We don't have any senators yet, but we're doing the hard work of having programs like this to help educate people about this issue, and we're so pleased that we have 4 members of Congress in the Chicago area who have been listening to the Palestinian community and are seeing the situation from a rights-based perspective, and not just one that about security and what's good for Israel's security, but what's good for everyone's. So I'll stop there, and if there are more questions, but I again can't emphasize enough the privilege it is to know and have the opportunity to work with May and Jehad over these many years. And if we are to feel hope, it's through people like them. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. So people know this Bill 2590 would simply ask Israel to account for how its money is spent. It does not of itself in any way limit the amount of aid to Israel, although that is certainly something that I think one would think about immediately. It just asks that our funds not be used for the purposes that Jennifer described. And there are many people on this call, or who might view this program, who are in a position to speak to their representatives, and who get calls from candidates. Every one of those calls, at least as I see it, should include or be focused on what they're going to do and why they're not doing enough in this area. We need to go to the question and answers, but before entertaining questions, and by the way, whoever is looking at Tom, or whoever is looking at questions that might have come in on the YouTube, I am not able to see them here, so I'm happy to get them, and if there are questions coming in from the audience, that'd be great. But before that, I'd like to alert everyone to 2 upcoming online programs that we hope you'll consider watching and suggesting to your friends on the subject we've touched on here. First, a program on facing apartheid in Israel-Palestine on Sunday, October 17th from 1 o'clock to 2:30, featuring Abusalim's Executive Director, Hagai Alad, and the Advocacy Director of the Palestinian Institute of Public Diplomacy, Inez Abdel-Razak, both speaking from Palestine, presented by the Committee on a Just Peace in Israel and Palestine, which is based here in Oak Park, Illinois. And secondly, and I think this will carry on some of the substance and deep meaning we've experienced here tonight, a 2-hour virtual People's Inquiry into Gaza next Thursday, October 7th, starting at 11 a.m. Central Time, sponsored by the Adalah Justice Center and Empower Change, launching a new campaign, Gaza is Palestine, and featuring accounts from Palestinians in Gaza, including Jihad Absaleem, on the impact of Israel's military assaults last May. For those who have not heard him speak tonight or desire to focus more, these are possible programs. We'll place the links to those programs in our messages to all of you and follow up on the program. Well, we've been receiving questions, I think, and I have a few. And maybe I'll start with both Jihad and May. In May, the phrase "ending the Nakba" was a slogan that united Palestinians in Gaza, and I presume in the West Bank as well. Why and how is the Nakba relevant to today's reality, and how can we see that first in Gaza and then in the West Bank? Jihad?
May, would you like to go first?
Go ahead.
On this?
Sure.
Do you have your microphone on? That would be fine. Sure, please.
Nakba that happened in 1948 didn't stop in 1948. It's an ongoing crisis for Palestinians. We see it happening again, like I mentioned, in Sheikh Jarrah, in East Jerusalem, in the neighborhoods, confiscating people's home, demolishing homes, kicking people out of their homes and taking it over. We see this, the story of the Nakba repeated itself in '67 and again in the Intifadas, and now it's repeating itself in Jerusalem with the neighborhoods of Sheikh Jarrah, so yes, if that answers your questions, I think it's an ongoing Nakba. Nakba did not end.
Nakba referring to the catastrophe of the formation of the State of Israel and the
in 1948,
expulsion of
Palestinians into the diaspora. Absolutely.
Jihad?
Yeah, in May of this year, in the lead up to the aggression against Gaza, and the moment when things became extremely violent, there was something kind of mind-blowing about May of this year. Palestinians in Palestine and outside of Palestine watched on social media, on their phones and on live television, the scenes coming from Sheikh Jarrah. And those scenes were extremely triggering because you have this character, Yaakov, or Jacob, from Long Island, who booked a ticket, traveled to historic Palestine, and became an Israeli citizen right away by the virtue of being Jewish. And 5 minutes after he arrives, he feels entitled to the house of the Kurd family. And then, people were watching the attempts to expel those Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah on TV and in clips recorded by people's phones. And there was this infamous dialogue between Mona al-Kurd, the daughter of the owner of the house, and Jacob from Long Island, in which she says, "Why are you trying to steal our home?" And then he says, "If I don't steal it, someone else will steal it." If you're not familiar with this particular moment, please, I highly recommend that you watch that clip. And that was very triggering for people because, for decades, Israel, through its academic institutions and a propaganda machine, has been trying to deny the Nakba, deny the catastrophe that happened to the Palestinian people in 1948, and deny that there has been a systematic process of erasure, of removal, of kicking people out of their land and property. And the Kurd family from Sheikh Jarrah, by the way, they were already refugees. I think they come from Gaza. I think. Haifa?
Yeah.
So one of the slogans that actually united Palestinians in May was, the Nakba has got to end, or the Nakba must end. And that was, thanks to the collective consciousness of Palestinians across the islands where they live, that there is a root cause for their tragedy. And there is a root cause for why people continue to suffer in Palestine. And that root cause is the Nakba and its continuation. The Nakba that happened in 48, the process of expelling Palestinians from their lands, replacing them by settlers, and then denying that this happened. And erasing Palestinian connection to their land and property and so on and so forth. So I think that's why people this year talked about the need to end the Nakba, because people realized that what happened in 1948 did not stop in 1948, like myself.
Thank you. Yes.
I don't think people who come in virtually understand that they'd be asking questions.
Oh, okay. I can repeat the.
I'm not sure people in the audience understand.
Okay, I can repeat the invitation from before. I think someone is monitoring the chat function. And so if there are questions that the remote audience has, please put them in the chat so we can relay them to May and to Jihad and perhaps to Jennifer. And also similarly, there should be cards for those who are present to submit their questions. It's hard to know where to start, May, in terms of reacting to your remarks, and I think any elaboration would be welcome. But maybe you could just give us a little more dramatization about how these checkpoints operate.
Yes. Like I said, there's where I live, Aram. Jehad, are you familiar with Aram? Aram is, Jerusalem, Ramallah Street is a main street that connects the West Bank to Jerusalem, Ramallah and Jerusalem. Aram is placed smack in the middle between Jerusalem and Ramallah.
And maybe you could elaborate once. How far is Jerusalem from Ramallah?
About 6 kilometers.
So it's very, very small distances here.
And Jerusalem is about 8 kilometers. For me, before the Intifada, I actually went to school in Jerusalem. And the commute used to be, it's about a half-hour bus drive. I mean, yeah, it's a long bus drive, but that was normal to commute to Jerusalem, to go to school, to go to hospitals and so forth. But if my siblings are going to school to Jerusalem right now, they will be unable to attend school. They would have to leave probably at 4 in the morning in order for them to make it by 7 o'clock. The route from Aram to Jerusalem had become so long through the checkpoints. Like I said, Aram had become home to 3 different checkpoints, and they are chaotic checkpoints. The worst of them all is Qalandia. It became so massive. You get high, the wall is incredibly high, is armed by soldiers with big machine guns. There's towers for observation, there's barbed wires, there's police cars, it's frightening. In fact, I'll share a story with my children. When I took my oldest daughter, Neda, to take her to Palestine, she probably was actually 10, 12 years old at the time. I wanted them to cross the checkpoint. I wanted them to feel how their grandparents actually go to work every day. My brothers, my nieces and nephews go to school every day, so I wanted my kids to go through the experience. So my daughter, the Israeli soldier let my daughter go first through the electric fence. There's an electric doors that they automatically shut on demand. So he let her go in, and all of a sudden all I see is the buzz goes off and the door shuts. And I freak out. Here's my daughter, is an American citizen, doesn't speak Arabic very well, crossing this checkpoint, Israeli soldiers all around with machine guns. Before we know it, there was tear gas. They closed the checkpoint, and my daughter is on the other side of the checkpoint. I panicked. I lived through checkpoints, but I panicked. It's my daughter this time. She doesn't know what to do. I screamed. I hit the door. I said, "You gonna let me in with my daughter, or you let my daughter out?" These checkpoints are frightening. They're chaotic. They're busy. They're very narrow. Tons of cars. Shooting happens at checkpoints. Birth happens at checkpoints. Violence breaks at checkpoints. People get fed up. I called my mother this morning. She was supposed to go give a training in Hebron. And today marks the anniversary of the Second Intifada. So guess what happened? They decided without any moment notice that all these 3 checkpoints are closed, meaning my mother couldn't get to her training on time. Leads to frustration. Children are often frightened, crying. I mean, you have to show IDs, and sometimes they let the mother in, let the father go back. It's really, really scary and chaotic. We talk a lot about Palestinians having a post-traumatic stress disorder. I was talking to before we started tonight. But most of us Palestinians don't have the post because this is ongoing. This is a daily life. Palestinians have to go through these checkpoints on the daily, and sometimes children have to go through these checkpoints to go to school without their parents, and they have to go through these narrow tunnels. When I went to Palestine this past few months to be with my grandmother before she passed, and I had to go to the airport really early in the morning to travel. And on my way, it was about 4:30 a.m. in the morning, and one of the checkpoints had incredible tiny tunnels, and there was a couple carts of street vendors selling food, and you get the workers getting out there at the crack of dawn, about 4 a.m. in the morning, to make it to work at 8 in the morning. It takes them this long to cross the checkpoint. That's in the hope that they would let them in. It's an absolute racist system. Who comes, who goes.
Thank you. Well, I think we maybe could... Please.
I just want to say that in 2007, I finished high school in Gaza, and I got admitted to Birzeit University in Ramallah to study engineering. I had different plans then. And I applied for a permit to travel from Gaza to Ramallah, which is just like 1 hour drive. I still haven't heard from Israeli authorities. So if those of you who happen to be able to go there, if you can pass by the Israeli agency that issues permits, ask them about mine. From 2007 till the museum. I'm still waiting to hear back from you guys.
I want to share one more story. Actually, this past year, just talking about, this is ordinary people crossing these checkpoints, going to work, hospitals, church, mosque, whatever it is, right? But then there was an incident when my grandmother got really sick one morning, and we had to transport her from Aram to the hospital in East Jerusalem. No ambulance will come to my town from Jerusalem. So we had to beg and plead and get an ambulance from Ramallah to go to Jerusalem. To our not shock, the ambulance was stopped. My grandmother was given 5 minutes to live. My grandmother is 93 years old. In the ambulance, they investigated everyone and searched everyone in the ambulance and required that my grandmother be taken out of the ambulance and be transferred to another ambulance, which will risk her life tremendously. This took about a few minutes negotiation. The paramedics that were on the ambulance had to leave their identification cards behind, drop my grandmother to the hospital, and come back for an investigation. And that was the only way to get her across to the hospital that was only 5 miles away.
These do not appear to be security issues. These appear to be simple harassment, simple degradation, simple attempts to either drive people out or grind them under the heel.
If my 93-year-old grandmother was a threat to their security, I wouldn't.
We probably should close by just asking each of you, if you can, to reflect for just a moment on what people can do.
I just wanted to say this has been, I know my story. I lived my story. I thought, I was sharing Priscilla earlier, I thought, writing this would be, talking about this was going to be easy. This has been a really, really actually hard for me to share this story, reliving these situations. In fact, my brothers, both of them, Saliba and I, we never talked about their arrest. We've never talked about that year and a half of their lives. They don't openly talk about it. So this week, in order for me to share, I actually had to write my speech down because I couldn't really just say it. It was incredibly difficult to share and to be reminded that this was, I talked about being 10 years old, and then here I am almost 43 next month, and I'm still talking about the same scenarios, the same situations facing my family and facing many others in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, and inside Israel as well. I asked people to question. I asked people to, Jennifer had brought a great point, that people are starting to question. People are starting to ask, to boycott, to divest, to stand up, to give Palestinians a platform to speak.
We need to listen.
And to listen, yes.
Jihad?
It is a moral commitment to stand up with the Palestinian people and their struggle for freedom, liberation. But even if people did not view it as from a moral standpoint, it's your tax money. It's our tax money going to subsidize and support this project and this situation. So America has got plenty of leverage, and it is time to condition and end America's support to the apartheid state. And I reiterate, please listen. Palestinians have been deprived from a platform for decades. They have been, smeared. Their story has been ridiculed and treated with cynicism. Mainstream media was never on our side. Hollywood was never on our side. Formal political institutions, they were never on our side. So the only way to balance this is through a bottom-up popular commitment to support the Palestinian people and to take responsibility for the actions and decisions of the United States governments and to disrupt the status quo. This isn't about, spilling more people or hurting more people. This is about coming up with a different vision for how people can live and coexist in a space with so much significance for followers of many faiths and people who come from many backgrounds. Palestine today is an example of how humanity failed in creating this example. And Palestine today is one of the places that we should try to create this different vision for how people can live together and for how justice can be achieved and how peace can be realized. And in order to achieve that, please listen to Palestinians, please open your hearts and minds, and please be part of our movement. And most importantly, be part of the ongoing congressional advocacy work that my colleague Jennifer talked about, especially the No Way to Treat a Child bill and campaign that aims to push the notion of the need for accountability and that American support for Israel should not be unconditional and and just made available all the time, regardless of what human rights violations Israel commit. So yeah, join us.
Thank you, Jihad and May. So it's listening, speaking out, and making good trouble, and we're going to be focusing on that more intensively in our final program of this series. I want to thank you both, and Jennifer as well, on behalf of St. Chrysostom's and everyone listening.
Good night, everyone.
We look forward to seeing all of you next week on October, or actually not next week, 2 weeks from now, on October 14th. At that time, we're going to hear an informative talk by historian and teacher Ayman Jehadi on the history of the Palestine-Israel crisis. And in the meantime, please do take a look at the paper of his that is in the materials we distributed. And if you have time, dig deeper into the information and the many links in his report. But more importantly, keep in your heart what we've heard tonight. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Good night.